Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something I think is super interesting. It's all about how Kenya's relationship with the U.S.,
Mm.
how it might change now that Donald Trump is back in the White House.
Yeah,
We've got some really interesting sources for this deep dive,
absolutely.
really focusing on a few different areas:
Yeah.
trade, security, investment, and diplomacy.
Yeah, I mean it's a really complex situation. A lot of potential challenges for Kenya, but also some really big opportunities.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Let's start with trade. As it stands now, Kenya really benefits from AGA. That's the African Growth and Opportunity Act.
Hmm.
And basically what it does is it lets them export a lot of their agricultural goods
Yep.
duty-free to the U.S.
Right.
Things like tea, coffee, flowers, all that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean it's been huge for their economy. Those agricultural exports are, I mean, they're really a lifeline for Kenya. And AGA has been a big part of that success.
But then we have
Yep.
Trump's America First policy.
Right.
I mean, that could really change things up, couldn't it?
It really could. I mean, look, we've already seen how Trump operates with trade deals. Think back to NAFTA, for example.
Yeah.
He's not afraid to walk away from agreements if he doesn't think they're benefiting the U.S. enough.
So are we talking about Kenya losing like all of those benefits that they've had under AGA?
Not necessarily, no. It's not that black and white.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, I think it's pretty clear from the sources that there will be pressure, to make some concessions, some
Sure.
serious concessions.
Like what kind of things are we talking about here?
Well, for example, they might have to agree to open up their own markets more, to American goods,
Uh-huh.
even if that ends up hurting their own industries.
Right, right.
Or another possibility is that they're forced to accept these stricter labor and environmental standards, which could increase their production costs, make them less competitive.
Yeah, I see. So either way,
Hmm.
maintaining that preferential access to the U.S. market,
Right.
it's not going to be easy.
No, no, it's going to require some really, really tough negotiations.
Yeah, and that's all tied to how vulnerable those key exports are. Tea,
Exactly.
coffee, flowers.
Exactly.
These things are, even small changes in trade policy could really disrupt things.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you look back at the data, it's pretty clear. When the U.S. imposes tariffs or quotas on those products, Kenyan producers are often the ones that are hit hardest.
Makes sense. They just don't have the same kind of bargaining power as some of the larger economies out there.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's exactly right.
Okay, so trade could become a much tougher game for Kenya under this new administration.
We're sure.
Okay, so what about security then? Kenya has been a key ally for the U.S. in the fight against terrorism in the Horn of Africa. How do you think that relationship is going to play out?
Yeah, they really have been crucial there. But with Trump, I think we might see a bit of a shift, maybe towards a more, what they're calling a more transactional approach to this whole cooperation thing.
Transactional. Now, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah. Well, I think, instead of just viewing security cooperation as this partnership based on shared interests, Trump might frame it more as almost like a business deal.
Okay.
Like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours.
Right.
So the U.S. will probably continue to provide support and resources, yeah,
Mhm.
but there will be a clear expectation, I think, of what Kenya will be offering in return.
Okay, I see where this is going.
Right.
So what could that return look like? Concretely, what are we talking about?
Well, it could be a few different things. The sources mention that the U.S. might ask Kenya to, contribute more financially to joint counterterrorism operations.
Okay.
They might also push for expanded access to Kenyan military bases. We're talking about places like Manda Bay and Lamu.
Right.
But again, with Kenya picking up a larger share of the costs.
Okay.
And then, of course, there's the whole question of logistical support,
Yeah.
providing troops, intelligence, and other resources that help really advance U.S. interests in the region.
So more cooperation, but at a price.
Right. Yeah.
Is that even realistic for Kenya?
Yeah.
Like, given their budget, the potential strain.
That's the big question. And it's something that, Kenyan policymakers are going to have to really think carefully about.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they absolutely need to maintain close security ties with the U.S.
Right.
It's crucial for their own stability, and it's, really important for attracting foreign investment.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they can't afford to be, taken advantage of or
Right.
stretched too thin.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a tricky balancing act.
It really is.
Yeah, it is. It really is. And that kind of brings us to another interesting piece of this whole puzzle, investment. Trump has never been a huge fan of foreign aid, has he?
No. Oh, really?
He's always kind of seen it as wasteful,
Right.
ineffective.
Yeah.
But Kenya is strategically important, right? So they're not going to be completely cut off.
So what do we think the alternative looks like then? Are we talking about like a completely different approach to how the U.S. invests in Kenya?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, the sources are pointing towards this move away from just these big, broad aid packages. They're hinting more at a targeted approach
Okay.
led by the private sector.
So what about creating opportunities for American businesses in Kenya?
Exactly. And think about it. Think about the sectors that Trump really tends to prioritize.
Hmm.
Infrastructure, energy, technology.
Yeah.
I mean, those are, that's where he sees the potential for big returns. That's where he's going to be encouraging American companies to invest.
So essentially, if Kenya can kind of figure out how to align its development plans with those priorities,
Yeah.
they could actually end up attracting more investment than before.
Right. It's kind of counterintuitive,
Yeah.
given how skeptical he is towards aid.
Right, right,
But I mean, it all comes back to this transactional mindset.
right.
He sees investment as a two-way street. He wants to see American companies benefiting, sure.
Yeah.
But he's also willing to make deals if those deals are mutually beneficial.
So it's all about finding those win-win scenarios.
Exactly.
Okay, so, but then, I mean, doesn't this also raise the question of China?
Ah, yes.
Kenya has been deepening its ties with Beijing.
Right.
They've been accepting these massive investments in infrastructure projects, like the standard gauge railway.
Right. Right.
So how does that, I mean, how does that all fit into this new dynamic with the U.S.?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
I mean, look, he's made his views on China pretty clear.
Yeah.
He sees them as a rival economically, geopolitically.
Right.
And I think he's probably going to pressure countries like Kenya to pick a side.
So Kenya's, I mean, they're caught in the middle of this superpower rivalry.
In a way, yeah. I think that's a fair assessment.
Right.
And this actually kind of neatly brings us to the final piece of this whole thing.
Okay.
Diplomacy. Kenya has always been very good at, maintaining good relationships with a lot of different countries.
Yeah.
But with Trump as president, I think it's going to become a lot more difficult.
Yeah. I mean, I can imagine it's, it's one thing to kind of balance those economic interests,
Right.
but when you add in the geopolitical tensions,
Right.
it's tricky.
It becomes a very delicate balancing act.
Yeah.
And, it's not even just about managing relations with the U.S. and China, is it? I
Right.
mean, there are other players in the region, the EU, Russia, India,
Yeah.
all vying for influence. So, yeah, Kenya is going to have to be very strategic,
Yeah.
very skillful to kind of avoid, being pulled in too many different directions at once.
Okay. So we've talked about trade, we've talked about security, investment, diplomacy. I mean, all these different aspects of the relationship between the U.S. and Kenya.
It's a lot, yeah.
It's a lot to take in. I mean, what does this all actually mean for Kenya? What are the kind of the key takeaways?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is that there's just a lot of uncertainty.
Yeah.
I mean, we really don't know for sure how Trump will approach this relationship with Kenya.
Right.
I mean, look, his foreign policy has always been, unpredictable.
Right.
Often driven by personal relationships
Yeah.
rather than these long-term strategic goals.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. He does seem to operate more on instinct than on careful analysis.
Yeah, exactly. And that makes it really difficult for countries like Kenya to, plan for the future. But I don't want to paint an entirely bleak picture
Okay.
because I don't think it's all doom and gloom.
Okay.
There are definitely opportunities.
Okay. So what? Give me some reasons to be optimistic here.
Well, I mean, as we were discussing earlier, Trump's focus on private sector investment,
Yeah.
I mean, that could be a real boon for Kenya if they play their cards right. They
Mhm.
need to identify those sectors where American businesses are, ready to invest, and
Yeah.
then just make sure that they've got that business-friendly environment in place.
A bit of pragmatism.
Yeah.
Willingness to kind of adapt to this new reality.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about being flexible.
Okay.
Seizing those opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think this is actually where Kenya's diplomatic skills
Yeah.
are going to be crucial. They need to build the strong relationships with the key players in the administration,
Mm-hmm.
make a strong case for why, investing in Kenya is good for American business.
Right.
And then just navigate those geopolitical tensions
Yeah.
without, alienating either the US or China.
It's a lot. Yeah.
It is. It's a big challenge.
Especially with Trump's unpredictability.
Yeah.
It sounds like they're really going to have to be on their toes to make this
Oh,
work.
absolutely. But Kenya, I mean, they have a history of resilience, right? They're adaptable.
Yeah.
I mean, they've weathered plenty of political storms before
Right.
and emerged stronger on the other side. And they have a lot to offer. A vibrant economy, a young population, a strategic location.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, I'm not ready to count them out just yet.
Okay, so there's hope for Kenya.
I think so.
But then what about the bigger picture? I mean, this potential shift toward this more transactional approach to foreign policy.
Right.
What does that mean for other countries in Africa?
Okay.
I mean, beyond even.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah.
And it's something that I mean, I think we all need to be thinking about. Like if the US is moving away from these more traditional notions of partnership, of alliances,
Right.
and moving towards this more self-interested,
For the
quid
wing.
pro quo approach,
Yeah.
what does that do to global cooperation?
That is a huge question to grapple with.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that, our listeners should really be considering as well. If the world is becoming more transactional, what does that mean for how we understand international relations? How does it affect, how countries interact with each other?
Yeah. It's a fundamental shift.
Yeah.
And it raises a lot of really important questions about, diplomacy,
Right.
the role of these international organizations,
Yeah.
even the very idea of a global community.
Wow. Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've gone from these specific policy changes all the way to like these really big philosophical questions.
Right.
It's clear that a Trump presidency is going to have an impact
Yeah.
on Kenya
Oh, yeah.
and potentially even on the world as a whole.
No doubt about it. It'll
Yeah.
be really interesting to see how things play out in the next few years.
It will.
Yeah.
It'll be fascinating, that's for sure. But maybe a little unsettling too. I mean, we've talked about how Kenya might need to kind of, adapt to this transactional diplomacy.
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like? Like in practice, what steps can they actually take to make sure that they're, protecting their interests, that they're getting a fair deal?
Yeah. That's where it gets really interesting. And I think there are a few key areas where Kenya can really use its strengths to its advantage.
Okay, so lay it out for me. What's their playbook here?
Well, first off, I think they need to be really strategic about picking their battles. They can't fight Trump on everything.
Right.
So they've got to prioritize. Focus on the areas where their interests actually align with his. So things like infrastructure development, counterterrorism, maybe even trade in specific sectors.
So find those win-win scenarios
Mm,
where they can, give Trump a win, but also advance their own goals at the same time.
exactly. It's all about, negotiation, compromise. And Kenya, I mean, historically, they've been pretty pragmatic in their foreign policy. They're not afraid to make deals, even with countries they don't always agree with.
Right, right. That makes sense. But then what about those areas where there's probably going to be some friction, like China, for instance? How can Kenya possibly balance? I mean, they've got this growing relationship with Beijing, but then you've got the Trump administration who's, they're pretty openly hostile towards China. How do they manage that?
Yeah, it's a tightrope walk, that's for sure. It's not going to be easy.
Okay.
But I think, one thing they can do is try to kind of compartmentalize things a little bit,
Okay.
make it clear to both the U.S. and China that their engagement with one doesn't mean that they're turning their back on the other.
So a little bit of diplomatic juggling, keep all the balls in the air.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And I think, this is where it becomes really important for Kenya to emphasize its own agency, its own development priorities. It's about framing their engagement with both the U.S. and China in terms of what's good for Kenya.
Okay. So it's not about picking sides. It's about, pursuing their own national interests, even if that means navigating some pretty choppy waters, geopolitically speaking.
Exactly. And I think this is an important takeaway for your listeners as well. I mean, in a world where, we're seeing this rise in great power competition, it's more important than ever for countries like Kenya to, assert their independence, chart their own course.
That's a really powerful message. Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the opportunities, the strategic choices that Kenya is facing. But if you had to sum it all up in one sentence, what would you say is the key takeaway here for our listeners?
I would say this. The future of Kenya's relationship with the United States under a Trump presidency, it's uncertain, but it's not predetermined. The choices that Kenya makes in the next few years will have a huge impact, not just on their own trajectory, but, they could potentially even serve as a model for other countries who are trying to figure out how to navigate this new era of what we've been calling transactional diplomacy.
That's a really great way to put it. It's a reminder that, even in a world where it feels like everything's about, great power politics,
Yeah.
smaller countries, they still have agency. They can still, shape their own destiny. And I think that's a hopeful message.
I think so too. It's a reminder that even in really challenging times, there's always room for creativity, for resilience, for strategic thinking.
Well said. Well, on that note, I want to thank you so much for joining me for this deep dive. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I really hope our listeners have come away with a better understanding of the relationship between Kenya and the United States and all the complexities there.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, I would encourage you to keep exploring this topic. There's so much more to uncover, and I think you'll find it really intriguing and definitely thought-provoking.
Absolutely.
Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic that's, well, shaping our world. Until then, take care.